Head of Department here at Department of Development and Planning. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker of the day, retiring after so many years in business, so many years in Norway, so many years, and so many things you've done, Andy. And from what I've heard, we try to take all this and give a review, but also foresee some of the things that will probably be in discussion in the coming years. And the title of your talk is Making of Green Engineers, Reflections on Sustainability and Engineering Education, which is one of our main fields of the department here. I won't go through all of what you've done in the years, but I will say a big thank you to you for all what you've done, what you've contributed with. And I'm very much looking forward to this, to hear more about your field, because it's not so close to mine. But anyway, it's very, very interesting. I hope you not just leave us, but still be close and come back and work together with us and help us and tell us if we're doing things in a good way or in the way yeah. I'm sure. So the floor is yours. Please, Andy.
Thank you very much. Great to have a chance to say goodbye a little more substantially than otherwise. That we could get this together. When I first came here back in '96, not so many years, feels like it. I entitled my inaugural lecture, How Can We Educate Green Engineers? And it was very much an attempt to argue really for the importance of what I call the social and cultural aspects of environmental politics that now we're looking at for sustainability as an important part of the education that we were carrying out in our department. And now when I'm retiring, it seemed appropriate to make a kind of a progress report to at least reflect on what, if anything, I've accomplished, we've accomplished. Turn engineering green, we're going now to make these green engineers. And it's very much based on, most of you probably have already heard, or some of you have heard already parts of this, or all of this. It's something I've been going around talking about as part of the outreach activity of a big research program several of us have been involved in now for the last 4 years, called Proceed, which has been funded by the Strategic Research Council and has involved a collaboration between Aarhus University and glad to see Niels here, Aarhus, one of our Aarhus partners. From DTU, the people who have now since moved over to our Copenhagen campus, by Ole Jørgensen, and at Roskilde University, where we've tried to kind of mix these fields, carry out what I like to call cross-fertilization of different approaches, different academic domains to look at what's the challenges and opportunities in engineering education. And we've done this with the ambition, the Strategic Research Council likes to fund a strategic research, so we intervene. So what I'm doing now is giving you some of our fourth phase, our fourth ambition, to reach out to engineering educators, and I've been doing this now for the last year and a half, quite actively running around different places, trying to basically present what I've accomplished, my own personal proceedings, which have been published in these two books, one that came about halfway in the process, the Hybrid Imagination book that I wrote together with Lars Bertin and Stine Hilbert Christensen, our partner from Aarhus, Kristen Herring, and the most recent book, The Making of Green Engineers, which gave the title to this talk, but also is my attempt to sort of tell my own story going way back to my college days when I discovered green engineers, when I wrote a book about steam-powered automobiles in the early 1970s, late 1960s, and found engineers out there who were trying to, in some sense, do alternative transportation research, alternative engineering research, trying to bring their environmental interest into the design and construction of pollution-free vehicles. And ever since, I've been trying to teach, educate, or more presumptuously, make green engineers. Anyway, what we've done in Proceed, we started with this ambition, our own way of sort of characterizing the challenges, was to sort of redo some of the terms that are used to talk about the sustainability challenges as involving three different aspects: the social, the environmental, and the economic. And we kind of characterized it in this way, that there are these overarching environmental challenges that not just engineers but everybody faces. There are the more societal challenges that were more specific for engineering and engineering education, sort of bringing in what Ulrich and a lot of us have come to call techno-socio competence, that engineers have to learn about social processes if they're to actually take part in the proper, what I call procreation of technology in various parts of society. And then there are the more technological, or what we can think of as cognitive challenges, that actually engineering knowledge in so many fields is changing due to this grand transformation that I've written about in different places, from science to techno-science, the mixing really of scientific, what used to be called science and what used to be called technology in new fields, from genetic engineering to meteorology to information and communication technology. So then what we did sort of at the beginning, part of Proceed, was to, a little bit as a group, but it was also sort of an outgrowth of the application, was to say that the real problem that engineering educators face is that there's this tension between what has become a dominant market-oriented or commercial strategy of responding to not just the challenges that we've identified, but to also the grand challenges that the National Academy of Engineering in the United States has identified. There's been this kind of dominant pressure on universities, not least engineering universities, to go to the market, to align their educational programs to market demands, as they're often called, to focus on entrepreneurship and innovation. And this has been sort of met by an academic-oriented or professional strategy, which is often said that the problem with market orientation is that we're forgetting academic standards, we're neglecting sort of what we've always done best, we've stopped being good professionals, we've lost our soul, some of the people even say, we've sold out. So you have this tension in most universities and between universities. And so this is one of the reasons why we sort of from the outset said, well, let's try to put our heads together and see if we can come up with a more integrative, socially oriented strategy that in some sense takes the needs of the market as well as the academic standards seriously, but also realizes that we've got to find ways to be much more ambitious in what we are going to call, this is actually Yetta's term from the beginning, to call it contextual knowledge. We're trying to integrate all the non-technical and non-scientific stuff in a much more ambitious way into engineering education. So what I've since done then, I was in charge of what we call the historical project, Project A, in the PROCEED framework, is what I've done is sort of look back a lot and try to look at the kind of historical roots of these tensions. And one of the first things that strikes you when you look into the history of engineering and engineering education is that there really are big, big differences, both between countries, but also between different historical epochs. So it really starts, when it starts to be institutionalized in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, engineering education is very much characterized as applied science. And the engineer is seen as somebody who takes the finding mathematics in particular, but also all of the sort of basic natural and physical sciences, and applies them to build various kinds of technical artifacts. And this was very much the kind of program of the École Polytechnique in France and then the early technological universities that were inspired by this model. In the middle of the 19th century, and then increasingly toward the end of the 19th century, you get another wave, really inspired by the German technological universities, where using more laboratory instruction, using whole new kinds of pedagogical techniques to not so much apply science as develop what started to be called the technological sciences, and to really see the engineer as an innovator, as someone who develops new technology, not so much by applying science, but by, in some sense, seeing what the market calls for, and in some sense turning what we can call the traditional art of invention, a craftsman's skills of inventing things, turning this into new products for the commercial marketplace. So the engineer here is no longer an academic expert trying to be like a scientist, but the engineer here is more like somebody who wants to be like a businessman, an entrepreneur. I always like to point to Stanford being established in the 1880s by a businessman. Leland Stanford made a lot of money in the railroad business, and felt that it was important to create a whole new kind of university that was much closer linked to business and to business values and interests. So we get this kind of historical trajectory, and then in the 20th century, we get a third type of engineering education, or conception of engineering, as I call it here, where the engineer comes to be seen as a public servant. And this is very much part of the whole rise of, in the United States, the state, the land-grant universities, where they're creating engineering as part of developing the state, developing the resources, developing the community. And the engineer is very much the kind of, what I like to call citizen engineer, trying to be a part of the community. This is very much the image of the engineer that comes to the fore in the progressive movement in the United States in the first part of the 20th century, the period of social reform, and when things like the Food and Drug Administration and working environment becomes a concern of the state, and they need new sorts of technical experts, new sorts of engineers to be involved in this. I've now picked up the term stewardship. It's actually Niels' suggestion at one point when he was commenting on things I was writing. That what's involved here is that the engineer is not managing things, but the engineer is helping to sort of guide the society, guide fellow citizens in the right direction by sort of, in some sense, facilitating all sorts of different sorts of development processes. So there is this sort of, I think, historical difference that's really important to keep in mind. And what then becomes also really relevant, it seems to me, is the contemporary discussion about different modes of knowledge production in explaining the differences in the response strategies. So that on the one hand, we get this new sort of mode 2 that's been talked about a lot in the science policy literature, that in the course of the last 30, 40 years, because of external funding, because of the cuts in direct funding to university research, so much of academic science and engineering is now carried out in this kind of transdisciplinary, these networks and these sort of systems of innovation, as they've sometimes called, where university scientists and engineers are more or less required to work with people in companies in what's often called a transdisciplinary mode 2. And then this is, sort of then been distinguished from the more traditional forms of science and engineering, mode 1, which were more internally driven, which were more sort of in the domain of research groups themselves and particular academic disciplines. So this is also where I sort of picked up on certain discussions that I had with several of you here about not just the need for, but also the need to characterize a third way, a third approach, a mode 3, that is in some sense combining both the internal and the external driving forces for research in a much more, again, socially responsible, socially oriented way. So I like to use the term cross-disciplinarity or sort of interdisciplinarity to distinguish from transdisciplinarity and from disciplinarity itself. And then I mentioned briefly earlier the different meanings of sustainability that are involved in these different responses. The one focusing very much on environmental science and technology. The second focusing much more on the economic side of sustainability. And the third focusing on the third part of the triple bottom line, the social or cultural sustainability, where it's so important. In most of the literature of sustainability, it's also stressed that if we're going to get anywhere on the path to sustainable development, we have to change our values and behavior as well as our economic procedures and our science and technology. So anyway, this kind of large unreadable chart is really trying to put these three different approaches, as I put it here, to sustainability and engineering education up against each other. And Jette and Annette and I have just recently written an article that tries to figure out and in some sense conceptualize what this third integrative approach with hybrid imagining as the form of learning and again stressing the integration of contextual knowledge, what that really means. The big distinction here is in ways in which the learning process is organized, but it's also very much in the kind of knowledge that is, you might say, transmitted or meant to be learned by the students. So there are some very big differences here. And what I think is really important to get a discussion going among engineering educators, and that's why it's kind of fun to go out and talk to them about this, is, for them to sort of figure out what they're doing and see the pros and cons and strengths and weaknesses of their different approaches. I think I'll skip these charts. I like to talk about sort of a little bit more grounded in the literature, what Mode 1 is all about. I like to use this book by Pierre Bourdieu that came out just before he died, where he talks about the discipline as a habitus. And what's important here is that by becoming and emphasizing specialization and niche seeking, as I like to characterize Mode 1, the incorporated discipline can act as a censorship. What gets taught to students is, so to speak, all the things they don't need to know. So they're taught to be ignorant and almost to be proud of their ignorance by being specialized in a certain subject. So I think it's important to kind of think about what we're really, so to speak, buying into when we focus on particular specialties, or what I like to call sub-disciplines, which is very widespread now in engineering education. So that, like we do in our department, we have planning as our discipline, and then we have all these sort of sub-disciplines of planning that we're creating educational programs around. I don't need to name names. You probably all know what I mean. So this I like to contrast then to transdisciplinarity, which is very much, sending the students out into these contexts of application, having them very much sort of be socialized into this brave new world of innovation networks and systems. And I like to call it the commercialization of research and education. And it's very much then, when it comes to the educational process, a process of what is called in the literature adding on. So there's this kind of adding on to the more or less core curriculum. There's the adding on of managerial and entrepreneurial skills. And then there's this very strong component, which is very, very important, both here, but also more and more frequently at other technological universities around the world. I've seen it at almost all technological universities in the United States, that as part of their educational program, they actually do work in companies. And in the United States, it's actually more and more frequent that they do work within agencies of the Defense Department. And this has become a very good way for the military to get, a little cynical about it, to get cheap labor and have students pay good money to go to college to work for the military. But anyway, what's involved here is, I think, often a kind of, and there's also in the literature this notion of the kind of over, what's it called, the over capacity of engineering education, that there's too much on the curriculum. And that what this means is that then the social cultural understanding gets kind of, in some sense, squeezed out at the expense of managerial and entrepreneurial knowledge. So this is sort of part of the background to what I think Lona was one of the first to start talking about, Mode 3, with some of her PhD students. We had a very nice seance a few years ago where we talked about these things that have been very important for my own thinking. But the idea is really to think about this sort of beyond Mode 2, beyond what we're in now, in terms of sort of taking what's valuable from Mode 2, taking what's valuable, it's taking initiative, being enterprising, yes, being entrepreneurial, but not overdoing. And in some sense trying to combine it with some, you might say, internally designed or internally motivated research program or research interests. What's important here, it seems to me, is very much to emphasize the personal engagement. And this is, I think, what's very important when we think about engineering education, that we find ways to, in some sense, mobilize the personal engagement that the students have in the issues that bring them here to the universities. And also to, in some sense, try to find ways to bring, in an active way, some reflective moments into the engineering process, into the educational process. So I think I'll just end with bringing it all back home and talking about this wonderful project group that I had a few years ago that I've been talking about ever since, which I consider to be a good exemplary case of an integrative approach to engineering education, or a fostering of a hybrid imagination. And it's really all based on our original ambition here. When I came here, and we had the FATS group, and we had, what we call it, the TMS down at basis. And it was very much this ambition to bring, this is why I was brought here. I'm about as far from being an engineer as anybody can be. I'm trained as a humanist. I studied history, philosophy, dabbled in sociology, have been an environmental activist. I'm really the kind of person that I feel is good to have around engineers, but I'm certainly not the kind of person who could be called an engineer. So it's this kind of approach that brought me here, and I think this kind of spirit that was here, and still is here to a large extent, to really have this contextual knowledge as an active living part of our engineering education. The big problem, of course, is that it's been very hard to kind of both scale it up, to bring it up to other levels in the education, and to also, in some sense, think of it more creatively in terms of what it actually provides to the engineering identity formation or the engineering education as a whole. What I think is really important about it is that it puts in a really kind of systematic way. And I used to always tell my students, you have to do this. This is part of our system. You have to spend 25–30% of your project work on non-technical stuff. That's the requirement here. You got to do it. I didn't make the rules. And then I said, you can either think of it as a burden, something that's really going to make you unhappy, and you're going to fight it the whole time, or you can try to have fun with it, learn something. And then I try, as my job, I saw always as a kind of resource person. My job was just to sort of battle, sort of exchange ideas with the students, be there to help guide them. A little stewardship role as a teacher to help guide them into relevant potential contexts that would be of interest for them to explore. And this group that I like to talk about so much is to me just a great group to show what we can do with our system. Of course, now we don't have project work, contextual aspects of project work in both semesters, and that's a weakness. This really was good because in the first semester they really reflected. This group wrote a wonderful first semester project on ethical issues in nanotechnology that really had very little to do with their actual technical project, but it was just a great preparation for them to see that if they're actually going to do some nanotechnology in their second semester, learn how to play in the laboratory, learn how to play with the instruments, learn how to work with the theories, do real science, then they had to reflect, because there was all these ethical issues we talked about in the first semester that, they realized nanotechnology is a little field. There are lots of problems there. If we're not careful, it's going to be totally applied by the military or by all sorts of unsavory people in the world, and it's not going to be useful to deal with, in this case, environmental problems. So their topic, and this was from the list, the standard way projects were selected, it was raspberry solar cell. It was a project that had been developed in chemical engineering programs in the United States. It was something that the students could learn in a semester, how to actually make these things. These are the raspberries. This was a very innovative group, so they also went for spinach. But the idea was to sort of figure out and understand how you went from raspberries to this kind of filter that you put on the solar cell to increase the electrical transmission. So what they did is they contextualized from the outset their project. They said, our problem is global warming. Our problem is not how to make a raspberry solar cell. Our problem is global warming, and this is from their report. So what they did is they wrote basically what would have been a very nice social science paper. That's the first chapter in the report. It was about the global warming debate. They read the IPCC reports. We discussed the Stern report, which had come out about that time. We discussed Al Gore's book. And it was very much in the air. And I think this is also very important if you want students to take context seriously, is you got to find what concerns them at the moment. And let them run with it. Let them, in some sense, decide for themselves what they want to do with the contextual book. So what was really nice about this group is that they were very ambitious in terms of actually doing the kind of things that social scientists do. Reading through reports, going through, talking even with people who have been writing the reports. There was also this report at the time of the Engineer Association, Energy 2020, that had come out with different sorts of projections of the use of different energy sources. So what they did is they first wrote about the context. And then they learned, then they learned their stuff. Then they, in context, see, this is the point. This is that they learned their scientific stuff in the context of the global warming debate. And they also, learned their technical skills in a very, very, I think, imaginative way. They realized that if you're going to make this kind of new technology, you've got to also make new sorts of equipment to measure the electrical efficiency. So they actually more or less made this equipment themselves, because this was their great idea, that, raspberry solar cell, that's easy. What we really got to do is compare it to other materials. Maybe, spinach, they just came up with this idea. Let's take another substance and figure out a way to measure and then compare. And so at the project, the exam, the technical advisor and I came up with the idea of the spin barrier solar cell, because they actually should combine molecules, because they had very different wavelengths when you looked at the electrical transmission. And then what was nice about this project, then they come back to the contents at the end. We've always tried to get the students to do some kind of technology assessment. And this group did it. They put the time in to make a nice chart about this with the SWOT analysis. They actually had a little chapter, a few pages, going into what SWOT analysis was. They had gone in and looked at how some companies had done SWOT analysis. They learned the methodology. And I'm not even talking about the groups that Niels had, which are really very good, that we've also written about in the book. But, what was interesting about this whole experience, was that, let me just go back to that first. Was that the learning of the scientific and technical skills was situated in the context of this particular non-technical problem that was their formulation. So to me, what's happening here is we're fostering a hybrid imagination. Some more examples of what I have in mind you can get. A very nice book which uses the term contextual listening in the kind of courses they give at the Colorado School of Mines, Juan Messina and Jen Schneider. It's a very nice kind of survey of different approaches to what's called sustainable community development, and the role of engineers in different levels in different ways in that process. Another, which I've talked about with some of you, is what they do at Arizona State University, which has the first school of sustainability in the United States and has a lot of different programs. They're trying to green Phoenix, which is really fun. One of the most sustainable places in the world. There's a really nice book that came out by a guy who had spent a year there going through all their different projects of community-based sustainable development in Phoenix. And so, let me just leave you with these. I gave these last year at a faculty seminar from our ESCO has started a sustainability project that Annette and a couple of others in our department, Mona and Kirsten, have been carrying out. And we had a seminar last year, and I made these 3 modest proposals there, and I think I'll just leave them with you here also. The first is really to rethink what we do down at bases and start thinking about the importance of kind of redefining the whole introductory year so that we have not just a TMS course or an STS course about science, technology, and society, but we have a whole first year that's about science, technology, and sustainability, with both technical and scientific courses that provide overview to all of the different kinds of issues involved, but also the kinds of contextual knowledge that I've been talking about. And then I think what's really important, and we talked about this a little, we had a little initiative last year called Loosely, that Ava and Yetta were also involved in the meeting place for university sustainable learning initiatives. And in Loosely we came up with this idea of trying to have and get instituted some kind of possibility for students to have a semester-long project work where they were required to carry out their work together with students in other faculties and in other departments about sustainability in one way or another. And the third, which is kind of fun, we had a course last year where Carol Mulder from Delft came and told us about this wonderful thing they do there called the Boat Week, where the students go off for a week as part of a semester-long course on sustainable engineering, and they are sort of immersed in sustainability talk. Can't get off the boat. They're not allowed off the boat until they solve their task. So Mona got excited about this. Maybe some others of you will. I've certainly come back to overboard. So with that, let me thank you very much for your attention. I hope you have some questions. Can we take some questions? Who's in charge here?
I guess I am.
And you got a question this time.
Yeah, maybe. I believe that you're welcome to address Andy.
If you dare in public.
Yeah.
Andy, I think, I completely agree with what needs to be done. The hard part is restructuring our curricula to make this a bit easier.
Yeah.
Because, every university around the world, almost without exception, is organised around these disciplinary lines.
Well, we're not. So I mean, in some sense, it's actually easier for in a sense, a transdisciplinary university to take the next step. you know, I like to say Old Boy's already taken the first step, you know, from mode 1 to mode 2. Now the hard part is going to mode 3. And it doesn't have to be more. I mean, we've talked about this quite a bit, you know. It can just be, in some sense, taking a step back to bringing more discipline into transdisciplinarity. And you know, I mean, in many ways, I think what I was offering, for instance, these nanotechnology students, was some kind of experience in very kind of traditional humanities thinking, or reflective, critical thinking, which is a kind of disciplinary knowledge. So I mean, it's 2 plus 1 makes 3, and it's very different. It's also a matter of being flexible, and I think it's easier for the mode 2 kind of universities that have already taken that step to go back and bring in a more integral way things that they've, you know, never really had, than for you know, disciplinary-based universities to jump over.
Sure.
Because they're so forced to now, if they do any change, it's to change more into the mode 2, into the more commercial directions. But they're really hard-pressed to then find that extra space. So in a way, it depends what you're starting from.
Yeah.
The problems are different. Because when I've gone around, you know, it's sort of interesting that it's the newer places where there's a little more understanding of what I'm saying. Newer engineering schools, the more classic, traditional places, they, you know, that's not engineering. But those are the same kind of places where they say business isn't, that's not it. So, you know, I think it really depends on your story.
And you haven't talked that much about problem-based learning.
No.
What's your thoughts about PBL engineering?
Well, you know, I mean, I love it. You got to if you're but I think, you know, what I think is really a problem with problem-based learning here is that it's not reflected upon. And particularly this part that I was focusing on, what's the problem? You know, and I think there's the real need here to be much more explicit about the problems. This is really where it started. This was exemplary learning. This was this kind of theories that were back in the 70s that started this whole push for problem-based learning as we do it here. It comes from different directions, though I've understood from the experts. But what was important there was that the problems came from real life. You know, and then you go out and you find a problem in real life that you can actually simulate or explore, you know, with your educational, pedagogical resources that were given to you. And here it was, you know, very, very, for many years, of course, it was all very, very flexible in terms of how to define those problems, because you didn't really have a disciplinary culture. You know, all the departments, it seems to me, were defined as you know, problem-oriented. And I think so the real problem here with problem-oriented learning, it seems to me, is that not only has it become, how to put it, a brand, you know, that it isn't really reflected upon enough, but it's also, I think, slipped a little in terms of the problem, what do we call it, problem analysis stage. So the problem analysis, problem identification. But the problems have become more and more internalized into the disciplines on the one hand, but then much more frequently. I like to say, we're teaching students to solve somebody else's problems. So basically the people who are willing to pay. You know, so that a lot of the student work is done on projects that are, you know, externally financed. companies paid for students to do problem-based learning here, so that those students can go out and solve those companies' problems.
So what's the
There's nothing wrong with doing that, but I think there's got to be space for dealing with real social problems. So I mean, to come to in some sense make it more pluralistic, the choice of problems, I think, and to make it more explicit, that whole process, I think, could be a very important kind of reform to bring about. And I mean, when I talked about these, these different modes, they bring with them, Ned and I talked about this quite a bit, they bring with them different ways of thinking about problem-based learning, different ways of thinking about the problem. So it's very important, I think, to open up more space for those kind of problems I characterize as socio-cultural problems that have to do with this kind of more change-oriented approach to research.
Just in continuation, I think that we probably should work more on having a justification of the problems that was kind of a checklist. Is it a societal or social justification, political, ethical, and so we should maybe work on a toolbox that could be understood in the different disciplines. We shouldn't yes. And how makes it less complicated.
Roger was talking about this at the course last year, these wicked problems. Maybe we should only have the students deal with wicked problems. And then they got to have 5 different elements to be a proper problem in our problem-based learning. That's good.
Yeah.
It's more a common end, because I'm thinking about that maybe it would be nice to add on your list the making of green researchers.
Yeah.
Because now the focus is on the students, but what I've experienced, especially at the PhD level, we have a lot of flexibility for doing mostly research and thereby educating the new teachers for the making of green engineers. I was just a short comment, but I'm just sitting with this sense, especially in the situation we're in right now at the university and at this department at present, where there is hard pressure for bringing in money, and I would like to hear your reflection upon what you see, because I fear a bit that there will be a further pressure for pure mode 2 research, and how to cope with that in a situation like that. How can we increase our reflection upon our own approach to research and our own engagement? I worry a bit these days what the coming years will bring. Not just to this department.
Sure, no, but I mean, we're not isolated, and we have to follow the orders from above. I mean, this is part of the problem with, I think, both Danish and the experience I've had in Sweden, and also Danish and Swedish universities. There's not enough relative autonomy, as it's sometimes talked about. The universities don't have their own endowments the way some of the richer private universities have. They can make their own policy. But I mean, we're very much affected by political winds that blow. I think what I would say are 2 things that need to be done much more. And one is, sort of arguing back, having debates, bringing ministers, people from the ministry here, and confronting them with qualified discussion and debate. Having students, faculty prepare for their visits and really try to, in some sense, affect decision making, because that's where it matters. And we can do all sorts of wonderful things on our own here at the university, but if we're not, affecting the direction of government policy, it's really hard to make a big difference. But the other thing, of course, is just to do more, more things that do sort of stretch the boundaries. I mean, it's all the projects I've applied for, and sometimes I've gotten them, sometimes I haven't. But I mean, I've always been trying to take the call and stretch it, you know, and bring in my own agenda. And I think, you know, there's also, this is the more at the personal level, it's very important, I think, to just kind of always keep, you know, I wouldn't say be entrepreneur, but always keep being enterprising. You know, there are lots of sources of funding out there. There are lots of different people to associate with. There are lots of good, sympathetic foundations out there that also can support various activities. And, you know, it's just to keep trying. And the more you can do together, the more you can strengthen ties with other universities in Denmark, the better. I mean, Proceed was an interesting experience in two ways. One was that it showed that in a very, very commercially oriented council, you could make a case for a critical reflective project and get funding. I don't think you could do it again at DSF, at Strategic, because they've changed their whole structure in that particular committee that gave us money, maybe because they gave us money. that committee doesn't exist anymore. But you know, there are always new councils that pop up. And I think, you know, what you have to do is really sort of keep, let's put it this way, keep the spirit alive. You know, Old Park has a great spirit, a great soul, you know, and it's just, it's important to not, you know, not forget completely where you've come from. You know, I mean, this was supposed to be an alternative university. This was part of the movements of the 70s. You know, this is trying to really change society for the better. And I think, you know, there are all sorts of things you can do. I mean, ARNA taps into all sorts of different kinds of funding. And some of them seem worthwhile, and some of them maybe. But, you know, I mean, it's to be enterprising. And I think, you know, both those two things are important. But the other thing that I learned from Proceed was that it's really important to spend time, you know, choosing your partners. Because I think we could have done a lot better if we had actually sat down a lot more beforehand and figure out what did we really want. It was too much of a, and I think a lot of us apply for funding in too instrumental or too opportunistic a way. We don't really try to, you know, change the world together with our partners that we're applying with. And that should be done also at the European level, because now there are interesting funding opportunities there. And if you find really, you know, like-minded partners, you know, put out a you know, some sort of call. Who's welcome to mode 3? I mean, you just say what you've been doing and say, I'm really looking for people who are on my wavelength, who would like to kind of apply for some big money together. And enough suggestions.
And then on.
Yeah. Well, I actually want to thank you, Andy.
Thank you.
I want to thank you.
That took some years before we actually got together and we found some kind of a melody together. And especially, I think I appreciate very much your mode 3 and your attempt to try to develop that. And I have joined that in trying to, together with Jette, trying to combine also the learning dimension to it. Because I think it has also something to do when we educate and when we become sustainable engineers. It has something to do with values, it has something to do with identity, that we never actually really speak about in education, and especially not in engineering education, because it's all competences, skills, it has to be relevant for workplace, etc. But the agenda for our education, it's much more than that. And this is what in my mind is the mode 3. And we can argue about the understanding of transdisciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity, and I'm still not sure that we agree. But it doesn't matter. Right. That doesn't matter. But Andy, I know that you have these 3. And you love to have to define 3 because it gives good relations. But I wonder, will there be a mode 4?
Well, let's hope there'll be. Let's hope there'll be a few.
Continued progress. What is just left it to us.
Let's put it this way. I mean, I always, when people talk about this love I have for threes, I say it's the simplest, the smallest number that's interesting.
Oh yeah.
Because two, it's black and white. It's either or. It's not really interesting. But if you have three, then it's interesting. And if you have more than three, it gets too complicated. At least for my system. So, I mean, I don't think we need to think about a mode 4, but let's at least think about enriching mode 3. And then mode 3 will become the mode 1, the dominant. And then we'll have to start again. I mean, this is the dialectical process. You start with your thesis that becomes the dominant, and then the opposition. And then you've got your synthesis. I mean, mode 3 for me is really a way of just thinking synthesis. We've got this real big, I think, unnecessary conflict in our universities between the sort of old-fashioned academics and these new entrepreneurial types. And I think it's very unproductive that it's a tension, and that there should be much more attempt to speak together, to find common points, to synthesize. And that's where I mean by 3, 2 plus 1.
Yeah, but it's
So
also
4
more
doesn't
than
really
that.
work.
Yeah, but it's also more than that, because it's different value sets as well. So it's more than just,
Well, synthesis, of course, is more than addition. But it's combining to a higher order.
Yes, thank you very much, Andy, for summing up all this. I have a comment, an anecdote, and a question.
You wouldn't be art if you.
No, I just looking at this, I want just to make people aware of that we in fact have this possibility, and we have been running for the past 3 years summer schools in our group, and it was a nightmare 3 years ago. We just got the resources for doing it before the summer break, but now the formal setup should be there, so it should be much more easy and less bureaucratic than what we experienced 3 years ago. So I would just urge you, and we did it in the Aalborg way, you could say, in the sense of having a combination of classes and field trips and so on, and also a small project, and the students coming from both in one course from US and another one from Europe. They all love it. So it's an opportunity we can
develop further.
Yeah. And then the anecdote was due to what Pernille said, because last week some of us was engaged in what was called a verdensuniversitet.
Oh yeah. You said
I sent the invitation around, and as some of you will know, 40 years ago, John Lennon and Yoko Ono was up in Thy, and we had the opportunity to the wife of the guy who made this verdensuniversitet was there for several occasions. And she made us a small, wonderful speech. The last day, we had a kind of celebration dinner Friday evening, and then she was saying, I really appreciate what you have been doing, and I can see you are somehow still putting alive a lot of what has some of the values from this verdensuniversitet. But as far as she could see, there was one thing missing, and that was this with living together, as in the traditional high schools and so on, and having the social contact and identity. And after she had finished her speech, one of the students raised and said perhaps she was not right on that issue, because what happened in teamwork in the groups was in fact they created friendships forever. And I think perhaps we underestimate this aspect. and it underlined that learning is social.
Yeah.
So I think perhaps we not just should say problem-based learning, but we in fact should value this social aspect of the learning process, and also bring in perhaps again more field trips and other types, learning in other types of settings than just in the classroom. So I think that I will more challenge the students than make a checklist on what, because I think it's by challenging the student on the problem analysis that we get into real learning, not by having a checklist. So I'm a big critic of the checklist, at least if they are not considering.
Well, just that they even, I mean, the checklist could be whether this is even a possible problem.
And also I think, just to chip in on that, when you have a co-supervising and you have two supervisors and one is a discipline focus supervisor, then you are and you have to convince the students on doing, then a checklist is a good argument if it's kind of approved somewhere that this is what they have to do, even if you are against it.
Yeah, and it should be in the study guidelines.
Yeah.
But again, I think the real learning takes place when you have this challenging of the students and get them to find literature and get them interested in doing a problem.
Maybe they should have the group rooms back.
When I go around and talk about old learning, what I like to say is it's student-owned education. So you make a real point of, at least in the best of cases I've been involved in, that we're there to help the students, but they own their project. They own their learning process. You talk about student-centered is sometimes the term that's used in the literature, but student-centered can still be that the teacher is telling the students. Just maybe spending far too much time telling the students what they should do, rather than just allowing them to do what they would like to do. I mean, it's sort of that's why I think this distinction between stewardship and teaching, or managing and stewarding is a nice one. That you're guiding, you're facilitating as a teacher here, rather than managing.
In fact, my question, I didn't get to my question. And it was somehow very related to what Annette said. I also think 3 is a wonderful number. But as I see it, perhaps instead of putting up in what could be a risk of having 3 silos, what will happen if you put them like circles that are overlapping?
Sure.
Because then you are looking into the intersection between the different areas, and I think something new and perhaps more integrated.
Well, I'll have time for more on.
So that will be my challenge to you. No, because Roberto was just mentioning, because there's been a lot of this with triple helix, and in fact we have now more called it quadruple. It's very difficult to say quadruple helix, but in the sense of also it's important to include the civil society and make much more focus on this. So not just the public and the private, but also the people and again, of course, the academia.
Okay, so you are thinking outside the 3 box.
Yeah.
Good.
4 now.
So
but it's impossible to say quadruple helix.
Yeah. Well, that's why, hybrid is also a better term than tribrid. Because I've been playing with that also, that what it really is involved is bringing all 3 together. But, in a sense, I think hybrid is nice because it has this notion of combining. So that's the other thing about the 3. Just find your opposites. And this is what I often try to tell my students, actually. Find your debate, find your conflict. And then your task is to sort of try to, not exactly find consensus or reach, but try to find ways that you can, get those conflictual sides talking to each other. And that's where I've come up with this notion of hybridity or synthesis, which I think is a nice way to think about. It doesn't have to be 1, 2, 3 in the same sense. It's a good point, you know, that they shouldn't be maybe put up like that. But and that's mainly just for heuristic purposes. But I think, you know, what's important is to always stress that idea of combination. You know, what we really want to teach is the art of combination. And really, in some sense, the art of being flexible.
There were a few comments. I won't take any more now, so the first.
I'm wondering if we're moving beyond disciplines. And because, you know, in a sense, the whole idea of a discipline is at the heart of your 3 modes. You know, one is disciplinary, and then one's transdisciplinary, and one's cross-disciplinary. But what, in the academic standards work that I was involved in Australia, one thing we realised across all the discipline clusters was the similarity of problem-solving processes. And I think we forget to mention the fact that almost every discipline is involved in problem-solving, which is not all that different to what's going on in lots of other disciplines. And then each discipline owns a certain amount of secret knowledge that you referred to earlier as you know, that's the stuff that makes you a part of the club, and the other stuff will make that you don't learn also makes you part of the club. But the cross problem-solving skills are much more common, and that's the stuff I think that that really bonds us together.
Yeah, well, also that and reflective thinking, and I mean being careful about your sources. I mean, there are certain sorts of standards there. I mean, I shouldn't. No, that should be covered. But I mean, I think very important are, you know, certain things that are, you know, part of being a qualified researcher. And this is really what we're trying, or a qualified scientist, or whatever you want to call it. This is really what we're trying to educate. We're trying to provide some qualifications. And I think, you know, problem-solving competence is one very nice way to characterize, you know, some of the generic nature of academic qualifications. But also, I wouldn't, ignore things like being reflective, being self-critical, and I'm sort of playing also now with the notion of modesty as opposed to arrogance and hubris, as another kind of quality that really can be taught and fostered. Modest about your achievements, but being in some sense proud of them also. There's a kind of modest, there's a fellow I was corresponding with who used the term modest self-confidence. But being self-confident, being in some sense, aware that you know some things, being proud of what you know, but then not being arrogant about it. I mean, I think a lot of these are sort of more ethical kinds of qualities that I would also say we should be fostering.
Yeah, I think that Arne asked the question perfectly, so I'm going to refrain from asking questions and just make a brief comment. And we've learned over the years that you have the appetite for threes, and I'm not going to say threesomes, but at least threes. But we've also learned that for you, the meaning is in the mixing. I mean, we've seen your ideas about the mixing of disciplines, skills and competences, but also different sorts of students in different environments. And I think this might also speak a bit to the question or the issue that Lone raised before. There's also a mixing of the elements of what being an academic means. So I just wanted to briefly say that at least the way that you practice being an academic not only entails being a scholar and doing the mixing in your analytical work, but also being a wonderful educator to students and PhD students. And finally, to have the threes. Being a public intellectual, being able to write newspaper articles, to take part in public debate and so on. And I would hope that that will also be something that is part of having a feasible and sustainable development of research and its interactions with politics. So I would hope that you remain and perhaps even strengthen your role as a public intellectual once you retire.
He's got to find the public. That's interesting.
Maybe you should just open your eyes.
Sydsvenska Dagbladet.
They're not interested in it.
Steve, the last.
Yes, if it's the last, I will just, I'll get to point on something else, but I feel very inspired about your way of actually presenting all this. I worked a lot as well, and I think I'd like to thank you for being that inspiring person in that area. And because I feel we increasingly we're challenged actually to keep up the spirit that you are talking about, right? And so there's another side of you which I think we should also embrace at this hour, which is your songs. Yeah, because there's a whole world out there.
Yes.
You know, when you feel threatened about can we keep up the spirit. So this side of you. So why talk about that?
Yeah. Keep on singing.
It's a permanent invitation for the Christmas party.
Just invite me back.
And it's been a pleasure. And for those of you who haven't had the chance to give him a comment or discuss with him, we'll have a small reception afterwards, so you will have the chance to approach him. And I'm sure you will be open for more discussion.
Yeah, just, my email address, I think, won't be changed. I'll keep it, will be emeritus. It's even a bigger title.
And the last thing before we go over to the reception is our gift from the department. So I want you to have this, and I want you to open it so everyone can see what's inside.
Oh.
So not everyone
What?
see it. And it's really something that can contain hybrid things.
Flower base. Beer glass.
Big one.
That is very Thank you very much.
And happy time.
Okay. Thank you.
So everyone, there will be something outside.
Esto.